Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the Hooksett Library. Speaking about these men is one of my favorite things to do. So it is the Granite Men of Henri-Chapelle or Henri-Chapelle. So this whole story, the beginning was simply trying to find my uncle, Paul. And here he is in civilian life, and then there he is circa 1943. His sisters do not know when that photo was taken, but my guess it was taken in 1943 when he was drafted. So my great uncle, PFC Paul the Boy of Nashua, was killed in World War II, but the family never discussed him. So in 2009, I had just finished up a project in Rokiskis, Lithuania, and I thought, well, if I can do that work in Lithuania, maybe I can try to find where my great uncle is located. So I happened to be on the Arlington National Cemetery's website for a different project, and I found a link there to the American Battle Monuments Commission website. And from there, I was able to type in his name, and I didn't even have his rank. I just had his name. So I typed in his name and I hit search, and up came up on the next page, Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. And on that page, it also listed that he served with the 78th Division of the 309th Regiment, and he was in Company C. I later learned that he was killed in action on February 10th, 1945, just outside of Schmidt, Germany, and he was 21 years old. And at that point, I ordered his IDPF from the military. And once I had that file, really the focus shifted from my need to find answers to letting Paul tell his story. So what is an IDPF? It's an individual deceased personnel file, and it was generated when a soldier was killed, when he died, and it contains the documents that record what happened to the body from the time the soldier was killed until he was permanently placed in a cemetery. It contains correspondence between the family and the military, the next of kin in the military. It also contains letters from the Red Cross to the family as well in the event that the military could not locate the family. The IDPFs also contain the report of casualty, medal citation, the Army effects, and the Army effects reports. And so some IDPFs are more complete. Some are about 100 pages, whereas others are just a few pages. And they are free to the public. They take about 30 weeks to 2 years to receive. So I tell families, just be patient. And if you receive no for your first answer, just keep trying. Usually my rule is I request a file 3 times, and then after the 3rd attempt, if I'm still receiving no, then I feel satisfied and I'm okay to just let it go and to move on. I did have an incident when working on this project that there were 3 families that had been searching for these files since 1992. And I requested them 3 times, and I had received no all 3 times. And I said, okay, I need to move on. And that was 2 years ago. And just this, it was either July or August, these files miraculously appeared in my inbox. And so that was a pleasant surprise for me. And it was one of my favorite emails to send to the family to say, hey, look, look what showed up after all this time. So getting to know Paul. So he was born March 8th, 1923 in Nashua to my great-grandparents, Archeel and Marie Lavoie. He was 1 out of 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls, and they actually had 18 children, but only 10 survived to adulthood out of infancy. So Paul was 4 years younger than the baby of the family, and 3 years younger than my paternal grandmother, Yvette. He was remembered as a clean, quiet boy who was a good fixer, and his mother depended on his skill of fixing things. And Paul was nicknamed Mother's Sweetheart Boy. He completed grammar school, and he worked at a local shoe shop as well as hospital before being drafted on February 9th, 1943. And at that point, he was 19 years old. He was 1 month shy of his 20th birthday when he was drafted. So Paul had 2 other brothers who served in World War II, and both survived. I interviewed one for the project. Of course, almost 70 years had passed, so of course those with his memories as well, but it was interesting. He wasn't in really good health, and he was waiting for us to go visit Paul. And when we returned home, we went to visit him, and we showed the pictures and whatnot. And about 3 months later, he passed away. So I was really on a mission to not only locate Paul, but to also locate Paul for his brother's sake as well. So Paul was killed just outside of Schmidt, Germany, and he was 21 years old. He was killed in action on February 10th, 1945. So I researched Paul for a year, and I ordered any and all records that included the after action report, operation journals, etc. I joined the 78th Division, and from that group, they had a fantastic research tool and model that I followed. That's basically how I knew how to order all these records and how to go about doing it. So after a year of researching him and having all his files, I said to my husband, well, let's go to Germany and Belgium. So we did. We traveled his route of march in Belgium and Germany, and I found a German World War II vet who was our guide. So he knew, I gave him Paul's route, and he took us. We walked Paul's route. We spent Memorial Day 2010 at Henri-Chapelle, and we were the first family to ever visit Paul's cross. And during that year time of researching him, I also located the Belgian couple who had adopted Paul. They are Jacques and Anne-Marie Corman of Stenberg, and the adopters like to be called the patrons. So I'll refer to them as patrons throughout the presentation. So here I am with Paul's patrons, and between myself and Jacques is my paternal aunt. So there are actually 3 generations of us in this photo with Paul at Paul's cross, because I was 20 weeks pregnant with my first daughter. So it was my aunt, myself, and then my daughter. At that time, she got to fly for free, so that was one of the perks of flying pregnant. So the adoption program, it's available for all American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries. So the soldiers can be adopted, and the patrons act as family, and they visit the crosses of those they have adopted. So there is an annual ceremony that's held in September of each year, and this one was just held on September 19th. So this is the most recent. Caroline at Henri-Chapelle, she emailed me this photo. So as you can see, it's a very important ceremony, and the attendees take it very seriously. So during the ceremony, the patrons of those who have adopted these soldiers, they receive an official certificate. And on the certificate, obviously, it gives the soldier's name and the division that he served with, in addition to the information such as when he was killed. So the patrons have to sign the certificate. It's very formal, and the patrons take it very, very seriously. And they can adopt as many soldiers as they want. So here is another photo from September's ceremony. This is one of my favorite photos because, as you can see, there's a row of men in the front, and they are saluting. They are saluting not only the soldiers for the crosses, but also the American flag that's at the end of the ceremony. And this mixture, these men are a mixture of Belgian and Dutch, I believe, yes. So the history of Henri-Chapelle, it's a 57-acre American World War II cemetery that's located in a small Belgian village between Liège, Belgium, and Aachen, Germany. The area was liberated by the 1st Division in early September 1944. Ironically enough, I had another uncle that's fit in there singing this song during the presentation. Yeah.
I had that planned, by the way.
Thank you, Tim. Ironically enough, I had another uncle who served in the 1st Division and who liberated this region where Henri-Chapelle is. So Henri-Chapelle was a temporary battlefield cemetery that was established on September 28, 1944, just north of the present location. And I tell family, I really stress this point to family because a lot of the next of kin are still confused. Even after all these years, they think, okay, my relative is still at this temporary cemetery. They don't realize that it was a temporary cemetery and that their loved one is now in a permanent cemetery. So in this temporary cemetery, there were 17,323 Americans, 191 Allied, and 10,000 plus Germans by the end of World War II. So it was the largest American cemetery in Europe at that time. So the unofficial number of New Hampshire soldiers was 80, and these men died in the Hürtgen Forest Campaign, the Battle of the Bulge, the advance into Germany, and air operations over the region. And members of the 607th Grave Registration Unit were in charge of this cemetery. So this quote, and this poem rather, comes from the superintendent of Henri-Chapelle emailed me this poem. And I will go ahead and read it. And it says, "There lies a hill just east of Flanders, where doughboys lie who fought so well, and there they sleep beneath the crosses while softly chimes a chapel bell. Winds that blow o'er lives undaunted, respect the thousand strong who fell, and morning dawn arises in silence, awake them not, for all is well. We who live must long remember, and seek the peace where brave men dwell. Could we but hear them ask the question, is this the last Henri-Chapelle? The hill of Henri-Chapelle, where the free and the brave men dwell, and helpless hands place row of roses, where the free and the brave men dwell, on the hill of Henri-Chapelle." So the repatriation program, Congress passed legislation in 1947 concerning final burial of World War II killed in action. So the next of kin were notified by the War Department, and the next of kin, in their notification letter, were given three options. They could either have their loved one buried in a military cemetery on foreign soil. They could have their loved one repatriated to America for burial at Arlington National Cemetery, or they could have their loved one repatriated to America for burial in a private cemetery. So on July 27th, 1947, the first shipment in this program actually came from Henri-Chapelle. Henri-Chapelle was made a permanent cemetery by 1960. So, as of today, there are 7,992 soldiers who permanently rest at Henri-Chapelle. So about 56% were repatriated home, and about 50% of the New Hampshire soldiers were also repatriated. And today, Henri-Chapelle is regulated by the American Battle Monument Commission, and during the government shutdown, it was closed. So there was, I did email the superintendent to see what was going on at Henri-Chapelle. It was closed, and he and Caroline Oliver, his assistant, said that the locals were very confused as to why the cemetery would be closed, why they couldn't get in to honor these men. But it is open today. So here's Henri-Chapelle today. I did take this photo. At first I thought maybe I should Photoshop these three individuals out. But then on second thought I thought, well, I really captured their reaction to the cemetery, them looking at the cemetery, so I decided to keep them in the photo. So here's another shot. My uncle actually took this from my great uncle's cross. And on these columns here are engraved the names of the 450 men who are missing in action. So Caroline Oliver at Henri-Chapelle, she emailed me this photo about 2 years ago. And I like this photo for many reasons, but for one of the reasons is that most of these men died during the winter months. And I think it adequately reflects them and their sacrifices. So personnel at Henri-Chapelle are trying to collect the stories and photos of all 7,992 soldiers, so they have less than 1,000. So they receive about 100,000 visitors a year. And they also receive a lot of Belgian school children who visit the cemetery on field trips. So I offered to help with New Hampshire once we got home, and after I had my baby, I offered to help with New Hampshire. So in January 2011, I received a spreadsheet with just their names, their killed in action dates, their military service numbers, their military divisions, and their burial location at Henri-Chapelle. I didn't have their town or county. So basically that's all I had. It was just a blank. They were from New Hampshire. That's all I knew. One of my favorite Holocaust movies is Schindler's List. In that movie, it is stated that the list is life. And so when I received the spreadsheet from Caroline, that was the first quote that I thought of, because not only are these men, they lived, but they also lived through their descendants. So here we have a group of Belgian school children visiting Henri-Chapelle. And here we have that they have stopped at a cross. And so one of the goals of the project is that when students stop at a cross like this, they'll be able to pull up that particular soldier's story and hopefully a photo. So the students will be able to learn as to who the man behind the name. So this is a direct quote from Caroline Oliver. She is an associate at Henri-Chapelle. And she says, quote, "The World War II generation is called the greatest generation. Although it was made of ordinary men and women, they gave their all, hoping for a better world. By recording, preserving, and sharing their stories, we honor them, express our gratitude, and recognize that their sacrifices have not been offered in vain." So of the 7,992 soldiers interred at Henri-Chapelle, 38 are from New Hampshire. And of the 450 names on the missing, 2 are from New Hampshire. So that's where the number 40 comes from. So 2 of the men are Private Omar Nadeau from Hooksett and Staff Sergeant Francis Larrabee from Laconia. And Staff Sergeant Larrabee's remains were discovered in 2005 in a German potato field. And currently he's buried at Arlington. As of June 2008 in Section 60, his daughter decided to bring him home. So most of the men moved to New Hampshire from Mass, New York, Rhode Island, Tennessee, Vermont, Canada, and I even had one from Poland. So who are the Granite Men of Henri-Chapelle? So I've listed them off. This takes a few slides because there are 40 names. But I wanted to do this for these men, so their names would be up on a screen. I also did this way because in the past, with previous presentations, I've always had 1 or 2 audience members that say, "Oh, I recognize that name," or "My mother knew that name," or. So I'm asked quite often, how did you start with this list? And I say, well, I started with the last name first. So I researched and I found, and I wrote the story of Private Everett Wiggin of Conway. I found his daughter and his 3 sisters. And so I was able to complete his story. So he was the first name. So their voices speak. So once I had the list, the spreadsheet, I obtained their enlistment records from the National Archives, which gave me their counties. I also ordered their individual deceased personnel files from the military. I contacted libraries, historical societies, schools, etc. I obtained their obituaries from the state library. I did contact Charles Shipman at the state library. He's fantastic. And what I would do was I would send him a list of 5 names at a time with the counties and the killed in action dates, and he would go through the archives, and in the event that he found an obituary, he would scan it and email it to me. So once I had the obituary, in most cases the obituary was fantastic because it told quite a story, the next of kin, it provided towns. In some cases it was just maybe 2 or 3 sentences that didn't give me any information. But he was really an angel in this project. So I also contacted newspapers about the project in hopes that they would publish stories. And the Union Leader did publish the very first article, and they put it right on the front page, so I was delighted to see that. I also used the internet, word of mouth. I joined all the division groups in hopes of finding a comrade. So out of the 40 families, I was able to find 19, and all 19 families they were able to help, except for one. So when I found the families or friends, I had a list of questions, and I would tell the families, here's a list of questions that would really help to get to know your loved one. But my very last question that I would ask a family is this, quote, what do you want a stranger to know about your relative 50 years from now? Because really that is the essence and the backbone of the project. All the other information, I can find from the public records. But that answer, I can't find, in the public records. Most of the families or friends were able to answer it. Others were not, and I would say, well, that's okay. That's okay, there's no stress. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Corporal NPZ Pack from Manchester, and I picked him because his niece Phyllis, she donated a book to the copy of the Hooksett Historical Society. So I said, we'll talk about Henry tonight. And do also want to mention that the name on his cross, the information on his cross stands out because it is filled in with sand from Omaha Beach. So anytime that they take a photo of the cross, any of cross, they fill it in with sand from Omaha Beach, so it makes the information stand out in the photo. So here is a photo of Henry that Phyllis provided. Here is Henry with his sister, Helen, and his mother. And over here we have a picture of Henry at the Dairyfield Country Club. So Henry was born in 1913 to Joseph and Salamina Pack. His parents were Polish immigrants who settled in Manchester. Henry had a brother Frank and a sister named Helen. Henry completed Youngsville School and a little bit of Central High. He worked at the city shoe shops. Henry was also a semi-pro golfer, and he played at Dairyfield Country Club. And Phyllis was always proud to mention this, that when the club found out about Henry's death, they flew the flag at half-staff. Henry was married to a woman named Helen, and they had one child together who died at birth in 1941. Henry entered the military on June 10, 1943, and he served with the 78th Division, the 310th Infantry. So he served in the same division as my uncle, just a different regiment. He was killed March 10, 1945. His sister Helen had to read and translate the telegram informing them of Henry's death because their parents did not speak any English. So tonight we're also going to talk about Private Omar Nadeau of Hooksett. And as you can see, I'm not certain how well his name is, but his name is also filled in with sand from Omaha Beach, and it is different because he is missing in action. So as I mentioned earlier, his name is engraved on one of the columns at the front of the cemetery. So whenever remains are located and and identified, they put a little marker next to the name. So as you can see, Omar does not have a marker. So here is a photo of Omar, and it was provided by his sister-in-law, Mary Nadeau of Hooksett. So Omar was born December 18, 1921 in Massachusetts, and he was the son of Napoleon and Ida. He was one of 9 children. He completed grammar school in Hooksett, and then he entered in a manufacturing job, and his nickname was Goo Goo. Mary wasn't certain why his nickname was Goo Goo, it just was, she said. He was known to be a jokester with a fun sense of humor, and he was always good for a laugh. He joined the National Guard on September 16, 1940 at age 18. He received training in Louisiana, California, and Georgia, and he deployed on June 6, 1944 with the 7th Armored Division. Oops, I'm sorry, I've got that piece up there twice. He crossed the English Channel to go ashore in France in August of 1944, and 4 years and 7 months after joining the military, Private Nadeau was on a mission to capture a town in Germany on April 15th, 1945. His last known location is listed as Dahlhausen, Germany. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. Jim here is, Jim, would you be able to pronounce that for me?
Not better.
So a missing report dated April 26, 1945 states the following. It says, quote, "This company was part of a task force of tanks and infantry. Private Nadeau was on the lead platoon of tanks when it encountered a heavy artillery barrage. The infantry dismounted from the tanks to seek cover. The platoon kept moving, and later when it was being reorganized, Private Nadeau was not present. Due to tactical situation, it was impossible to make a search. The search began later on. In 1949, a group of military investigators returned to the area. They contacted and interrogated proper authorities of surrounding towns. They also checked records. They could not find any sort of results as to what happened to Private Nadeau. They did come up with 3 findings, though. The remains of 2 U.S. deceased were found near Lintrop at the time of local actions. These remains were taken away by the U.S. forces at that time. B, disinterment of an unknown deceased in a certain cemetery revealed that no association with the deceased in question is possible. And the third finding, the area mentioned in Investigation Directive 47 and basic documents was searched, however, the result was negative. So in this particular investigation, they concluded it is recommended that all unknowns recovered from subject area be rechecked for possible association. The next investigation happened in December 1951, when a reinvestigation of the case had been requested in an attempt to locate the remains of Private Nadeau. The findings for this investigation state, quote, "to the effect that no unknown graves are located in the vicinity of where Private Nadeau was last seen, and based on Mr. Stricter's statements that only one American deceased was seen in Dahlhausen, it must be concluded that this deceased was Private Nadeau, i.e. the deceased in question." It also goes on to say that there is no possibility that Private Nadeau was buried by the German military due to the fact that after the April 15, 1945, none of the towns around Dahlhausen was retaken by the Germans. So this report recommends, quote, that the U.S. military cemetery where the American deceased were evacuated to from the Dahlhausen area be rechecked for an unknown recovered from on April 16, 1945, in order to associate these remains with the deceased in question. So that was the end of the 1949 search. And then in 1951, members of the War Department issued the following report. So there were 3 investigations to try to locate Private Nadeau. And this one says, approximately 19 casualties occurred during the engagement against the enemy, where Private Nadeau was last seen. It is not known whether subject casualty was wounded or captured, inasmuch as there are no available witnesses. Subject casualty was never reported a prisoner of war through any source, official or unofficial, and field investigations conducted on November 30th, 1949 and December 19th, 1950 failed to locate the remains of Nadeau. It goes on to say that they basically could not locate any unknown remains of American deceased recovered from this vicinity. So their final decision was to ultimately determine that the remains of Private Omar Nadeau be considered non-recoverable. So that is what happened to Private Nadeau. So the Granite Men of Henri-Chapelle, as I mentioned earlier, the project started in January 2011, and I finished in July of 2012. And I published the stories in June of 2013, and during that time we had our second child. So the book itself is a compilation of all 40 stories. And I tried to make it a celebration of life through stories and photos, which is why I did not include the causes of death for these men, out of respect for them themselves and for their families as well. And I tell people that if you are really are interested in the causes of death, feel free to either email me and ask me, or you can go ahead and order the IDPFs. They just take up to 2 years to receive. So I tell people also that this book is for them, it's about them, and it's because of them. And basically it has everything to do with them. And I say the same, I started in Vermont, the Vermont names in December. So the shift has moved on to the Green Mountain State. So on his deathbed, Daniel Webster stated, "I still live," and in some ways, so do the Granite Men of Henri-Chapelle. So the future, I received this surprise news this summer. The World War II Memorial down in Washington, D.C. is working on a smartphone app. And so their goal is to collect a story to represent the 56 pillars. And they want to represent 56 men. So when a visitor approaches one of the pillars, let's say, example, Mississippi, they'll be able to use his smartphone and be able to pull up an app and hopefully pull up a story and a photo of one soldier from Mississippi to represent his state. And so I received notification that somehow the group in charge of this project decided to pick my Uncle Paul to represent New Hampshire. So I thought, good for Paul. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It comes from a Vietnamese monk, and he says, "If you look deeply into the palm of your hand, you will see your parents and all generations of your ancestors. All of them are alive in this moment. Each is present in your body. You are the continuation of each of these people." So here for this photo, when we had our first daughter, the one that I was pregnant with when we went over, I emailed the photo to Caroline at Henri-Chapelle, and she went ahead and she printed it off and placed it at Paul's cross. And then when we had our second daughter, who we named Chapelle, she did the same as Chapelle's photo, and she placed it at Paul's cross. And as you can see, his name is filled in with sand from Omaha Beach in both photos. So my last two slides concern research tools, because I know many audience members are either doing some research or whatnot. So I'll leave these two slides up, and then I can go ahead and open it up to any questions or comments that there may be out there in the audience. Yes.
I have an uncle that died in 1944 in Anzio, Italy. And I went, 57 years later, I went to see his grave, his cross.
Nice.
Yeah. And nobody in our family had ever been. And he died on May 25th, 1944. And my grandmother was still living then. And she died October 25th, 1945.
Goodness.
So none of us knew what my grandmother received from the government.
Right, right.
And I got in touch with Gene Shaheen, and we got his medals.
Right.
I got his medals 68 years later.
Right, and I did the same. Thank you for mentioning the medals, because each soldier was given or entitled to a replacement set. A lot of families don't know that. So I ordered Paul's medal, so I have his medals at home. But no, there's many ways around it. A lot of families, when they approach me, they say, "Geez, I don't even know where to begin." And I say, "Well, it's very basic. I know it sounds very overwhelming, but we can get his medals, his IDPF, his military files." And I said, you just have to be patient.
Yeah,
is what I tell families.
She's very good.
Yeah, she's very, and you just have to be patient, but you have to be persistent too.
Yes.
How was you related to him?
He is my great uncle. on my dad's mother's side. Yeah, so the family never talked about him, and even when I interviewed his 3 living siblings, they didn't know, they didn't have anything to tell me. So the interviews turned into me telling them, okay, well, here's Paul, here's where he at, he served with the 78th Division, he was killed here, he's buried here, so that's how it turned into, you know, I was hoping to gain information from them, but as it turned out, I had the information that they needed and wanted, and that's the case with a lot of families, and so that's why I lose some time with this project, because I help the families obtain the medals and the files and whatnot. So there is a lot of facets to the project. It's not just collecting stories and photos, but it's also me helping the families as well.
Yeah, just like my uncle, he came
Right.
from a family of 10 brothers and 2 sisters, so that's 12.
Right.
And
right.
he was a baby of the family.
Right.
He was my father's brother.
Mhm. And it's fantastic, you know, when you find your relative and then
Yeah.
when you visit the cemetery. It's very
It's beautiful.
and they take very well care of the cemeteries overseas. Yes.
Do you know of anybody that's doing the same research with the other military cemeteries in Europe?
I don't know. I had been approached by the cemetery in the Netherlands to do New Hampshire, to continue, you know, with New Hampshire in that particular cemetery. But I'm working on Vermont for this one, and I do feel somewhat of a connection to Henri-Chapelle. And it turns out the local, my hometown paper did an article, and I did receive an email from one of the readers, and he says, well, my dad is buried in this cemetery in the Netherlands. And so we started emailing and whatnot, and come to find out he was my neighbor.
So the greatest majority of those people died in the battle.